Good evening, and welcome back to Chill and Feel Chronicles, a place where history slows down, the world grows quieter, and every forgotten story comes back to life. Tonight, find a comfortable place to sit or lie down, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and join us on a journey into one of the darkest chapters humanity has ever endured. Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing historical documentaries like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to life. And before we travel back through the centuries, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? It's always wonderful to see history lovers joining us from every corner of the world. Now, picture yourself in a thriving European city in the year 1347. The first light of dawn spills across rows of stone rooftops. Church bells echo through the cool morning air, calling people to another ordinary day. Bakers pull warm loaves from their ovens. Merchants arrange colorful fabrics and fresh produce in the marketplace. Children laugh as they race through narrow streets, while sailors unload valuable cargo from ships that have just arrived after months at sea. Everything feels familiar. Everything feels safe. And yet, hidden aboard one of those ships is an invisible traveler that no king can command, no army can defeat, and no wall can keep out. No one notices it. No one fears it. No one imagines that within a matter of months, entire neighborhoods will fall silent. Church bells will ring not for celebration, but for endless funerals, and Europe itself will never be the same again. What if your closest neighbor disappeared before sunrise? What if every knock on your door filled your family with terror? What if the person you kissed goodbye in the morning was gone before nightfall? And perhaps the greatest question of all, how did ordinary people survive the Black Death? This is not simply the story of a disease. It is the story of mothers and fathers, merchants and monks, kings and beggars, people who woke expecting another ordinary day, only to find themselves living through one of history's greatest catastrophes. Tonight, we won't only witness the Black Death. We will walk its streets, hear its church bells, stand beside those who had no idea the world they knew was about to disappear. This is the year the world stopped breathing. Long before fear became the language of an entire continent, Europe was alive with the sounds of ordinary life. As the sun climbed above the horizon, church bells echoed across fields and rooftops, announcing the beginning of another day. Farmers walked behind wooden plows pulled by tired oxen. Merchants pushed heavily loaded carts toward crowded marketplaces. Blacksmiths lit their forges before dawn, while bakers filled narrow streets with the comforting smell of fresh bread. To the people of Europe, the future seemed uncertain, but familiar. No one imagined the greatest disaster of their age had already begun its journey toward them. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was home to nearly 80 million people. Kingdoms competed for power, trade connected distant ports, and cities continued to grow larger every year. Although life was often difficult, there was also opportunity. Wealthy merchants expanded their businesses across the Mediterranean and beyond. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to holy sites. Students gathered in famous universities to study philosophy, medicine, and theology. The continent appeared to be thriving, yet beneath this appearance of progress lay a fragile world held together by little more than hope. European cities were crowded far beyond what their streets had been designed to hold. Houses leaned against one another, so closely that neighbors could speak through open windows without raising their voices. Most homes were built from wood, with straw roofs that trapped moisture and attracted insects. Narrow alleys rarely saw direct sunlight, remaining damp throughout the year. Clean water was a luxury few people enjoyed. Most families drew water from public wells that were easily contaminated. Household waste, animal manure, and even human sewage were commonly thrown directly into the streets. Rain washed much of it away, but not before foul-smelling pools collected between buildings. The air carried the mixed odors of smoke, livestock, spoiled food, and waste almost everywhere people lived. Few questioned these conditions. They had known no other way. Among the pigs wandering freely through the streets, the stray dogs searching for scraps, and the horses pulling heavy wagons, another creature flourished almost unnoticed. Rats. They slipped through warehouses, nested beneath floorboards, and feasted on overflowing piles of grain. They climbed aboard merchant ships in every major port and multiplied wherever food could be found. To most people, rats were simply another unpleasant part of city life. Children chased them away with sticks. Shopkeepers cursed them for stealing grain. Sailors expected to share every voyage with dozens of them. No one suspected they would soon become silent companions to one of history's deadliest killers. Beyond the city walls, life followed a different rhythm. The vast majority of Europeans were farmers. Their days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. Seasons ruled every decision they made. A successful harvest meant survival through the winter. A failed harvest could mean hunger, debt, or death. Entire families worked together, planting, harvesting, repairing fences, and caring for livestock with little rest. For peasants, life was demanding but predictable. For merchants, every journey carried both profit and danger. Caravans crossed mountains and forests, while ships sailed from ports in Italy to distant markets around the Black Sea and the Middle East. Silk, spices, precious metals, wool, and grain moved across continents, linking Europe with lands thousands of miles away. These trade routes brought unimaginable wealth to some cities, but they would also carry something far more dangerous than any valuable cargo. Above both peasants and merchants stood Europe's nobles. Within stone castles, lords and ladies lived lives that seemed far removed from the struggles of ordinary people. Great halls hosted feasts lit by hundreds of candles. Knights trained in castle courtyards. Musicians entertained guests while servants hurried between kitchens and banquet tables. Even kings believed their kingdoms could withstand almost any threat. Wars had come and gone. Famines had tested entire generations. Rebellions had risen and fallen. Europe had survived them all. Surely, whatever challenges lay ahead could also be overcome. But history has a way of humbling even the most powerful civilizations. Invisible to every king, priest, merchant, and farmer, a chain of events had already begun far beyond Europe's borders. A danger too small to be seen was moving steadily westward, hidden inside ships, hidden among cargo, hidden within creatures no one thought worth fearing. Within only a few years, church bells would no longer celebrate weddings or holy festivals. They would ring almost without pause for the dead. And before the nightmare finally ended, nearly half of Europe's population would be gone. Disasters rarely announced themselves. They arrive quietly, hidden within ordinary things. A merchant's wagon, a sailor's cargo, a grain sack tied with rough rope, or the tiny footsteps of a rat slipping unnoticed through the darkness. Long before Europe realized it was facing catastrophe, an invisible chain of events had already begun thousands of miles to the east. For centuries, the Silk Road had been one of humanity's greatest achievements. Stretching across deserts, mountains, and vast grasslands, it connected China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe into a network unlike anything the world had seen before. Silk, spices, porcelain, precious stones, and exotic goods traveled from one civilization to another. Along these routes came new inventions, new religions, new ideas, and enormous wealth. The Silk Road brought civilizations together, but it also carried something no merchant intended to sell. Among sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and wooden crates filled with valuable cargo lived black rats. Hidden within their thick fur were tiny fleas, almost impossible to notice. These insects fed on the blood of infected rodents, unknowingly carrying a deadly bacterium known today as Yersinia pestis. As caravans crossed continents and ships sailed between distant ports, the rats traveled with them. No customs officer inspected them, no city gate stopped them. Every successful trade expedition carried the possibility that death itself was moving silently beside it. By the middle of the 14th century, the disease had spread westward across Asia, leaving devastated communities behind, yet Europe remained unaware. News traveled slowly, and tales of sickness in distant lands sounded like little more than frightening rumors. Then came one of history's most infamous sieges. On the northern coast of the Black Sea stood the bustling trading city of Kappa, a wealthy Genoese colony that linked Europe with Asia. Merchants from across the known world gathered there to exchange goods before continuing their long journeys west. In the year 1346, Kaffa was surrounded by the army of the Mongol Golden Horde. At first, the siege appeared no different from countless others. Walls were defended, supplies were rationed, archers watched from the battlements. But something unexpected began happening inside the Mongol camp. Soldiers started dying, not from arrows, not from starvation, but from a mysterious illness that spread with terrifying speed. According to several contemporary chroniclers, the Mongol army, desperate to break the city's defenses, catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the walls. Whether this dramatic event happened exactly as described remains debated by historians, but there is little doubt that the disease found its way into Kaffa during the siege. Once inside the crowded city, it spread rapidly. Merchants who escaped the siege believed they had survived. In reality, many were carrying history's deadliest passenger. As Genoese ships fled across the Black Sea and entered the Mediterranean, they carried frightened sailors, desperate refugees, valuable cargo, and countless rats hiding below deck. The voyage west seemed uneventful, until people began dying. At first it was only one sailor, then another. Within days, healthy men collapsed with burning fevers. Painful swellings appeared beneath their arms, around their necks, and in their groins. Dark patches spread across their skin as their bodies weakened. Some became delirious, whispering incoherent prayers before falling silent forever. The survivors had nowhere to escape. A ship at sea was a floating prison. The dead remained beside the living. The living waited to become the dead. In the autumn of 1347, several of these ships reached the island of Sicily. As they entered the harbor of Messina, local residents expected another ordinary trading fleet. Instead, they witnessed a nightmare. Many sailors never stepped onto the docks. They lay motionless across the decks, their bodies already lifeless beneath the Mediterranean sun. Others stumbled ashore, barely able to stand, their faces pale, their breathing shallow, their skin marked by grotesque black swellings that no physician could explain. The smell of death drifted from the ships long before the cargo was unloaded. Panic spread almost instantly. Authorities ordered the vessels to leave the harbor, hoping the danger could simply be sent away. But it was already too late. The rats had left the ships. The fleas had found new hosts. And the invisible enemy had stepped onto European soil. No army marched through the city gates. No banners announced an invasion. No king declared war. Yet a force far more powerful than any empire had arrived. Within months, the plague would race from port to port, from village to village, and from kingdom to kingdom with astonishing speed. Europe had welcomed countless merchant ships before. This time, it had unknowingly welcomed death itself. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary fever. A merchant complained of feeling unusually tired after returning from the docks. A fisherman awoke shivering, despite the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. A young mother found herself unable to rise from bed, her body aching as though every bone had been struck with a hammer. No one was alarmed. People became sick every day. Fevers came and went. Life continued. But this illness was different. It moved with terrifying speed. By evening, the fever had become unbearable. Victims burned with an intense heat that no cold cloth or herbal remedy could relieve. Their heads throbbed relentlessly, their muscles cramped, and every breath became an exhausting effort. Some became so thirsty that they begged constantly for water, yet drinking brought little comfort. Others drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling prayers or calling the names of loved ones who were no longer in the room. Families gathered around the bedside, believing the worst would soon pass. Instead, the nightmare had only begun. Within a day or two, strange swellings appeared beneath the skin. At first they were small and tender, often hidden beneath the arms, along the neck, or deep in the groin. But they grew rapidly, becoming swollen, dark, and unimaginably painful. These enlarged lymph nodes, later known as buboes, could grow to the size of an apple or even larger. Every movement became agony. Simply turning over in bed felt unbearable. Even the weight of a blanket could make victims cry out in pain. Contemporary witnesses struggled to describe what they were seeing. Some believed the swellings were poison trapped inside the body. Others thought they were signs of God's anger made visible upon human flesh. No physician truly understood them. No treatment could stop them. As the disease progressed, the symptoms became even more horrifying. Dark blotches spread across the skin as tiny blood vessels burst beneath the surface. Fingers and toes sometimes turned black as tissue began to die. Faces became pale and exhausted, while breathing grew shallow and irregular. These blackened patches would later inspire one of history's most haunting names, the Black Death. Although medieval people did not call it by that name at the time, they could see death written upon the body long before life had left it. The illness showed no mercy, young or old, rich or poor, priest or beggar. Healthy people who had been laughing in the marketplace only days before were now unable to stand without assistance. Some victims survived 4 or 5 days. Many died even sooner. One morning they were working in the fields. By the week's end, they were buried beneath fresh earth. Sometimes there was not even enough time to prepare a proper funeral. The speed of the disease left entire communities in shock. Neighbors' healthy families disappear almost overnight. A husband carried his feverish wife to bed, only to become sick himself the following morning. Children sat beside parents who would never wake again. Houses that had echoed with conversations suddenly became silent. Then came another terrifying realization. The disease did not remain inside one home. It appeared in the house next door. Then another. Then another. Every sunrise revealed new victims. Church bells rang so frequently that many people stopped counting the funerals. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. People no longer greeted one another with warm embraces. Friends hesitated before shaking hands. Customers avoided busy markets. Travelers were viewed with suspicion. Every stranger might be carrying death. Every cough drew frightened glances. Every fever became a reason to panic. Rumors multiplied almost as quickly as the disease. Some claimed poisoned wells were responsible. Others whispered that foreigners had brought a terrible curse. There were stories of strange clouds drifting across the countryside, carrying invisible poison. Astrologers pointed toward unusual alignments of the planets, insisting the heavens had foretold this disaster. Priests urged repentance, believing humanity was suffering divine punishment for its sins. In truth, almost no one understood what was happening. Without knowledge of bacteria, fleas, or infectious disease, people searched desperately for explanations that matched the world they knew. Meanwhile, physicians found themselves powerless. Many wore long robes, gloves, and scented herbs around their necks in hopes of avoiding infection. They prescribed bloodletting herbal mixtures, perfumes, and prayers. Wealthy families purchased expensive remedies made from crushed gems or rare spices. Nothing consistently worked. Every failed treatment deepened the growing despair. Soon, the greatest enemy was no longer only the disease itself. It was uncertainty. No one knew who would fall ill next. No one knew why one member of a family survived while another died. No one knew whether tomorrow would bring relief or another funeral. As panic tightened its grip on every town and village, ordinary routines began to collapse. Shops remained closed. Harvests were left unfinished. Schools fell silent. Even places of worship, once filled with comfort and certainty, became crowded with frightened people searching for answers that no one could provide. Europe was no longer simply fighting an epidemic. It was fighting an invisible enemy that struck without warning, spared almost no family, and transformed every ordinary sound, a cough in the night, footsteps at the door, the ringing of church bells, into a reminder that death could already be waiting just outside. And for millions of people, the worst was still to come. A city does not die all at once. It dies one familiar sound at a time. The laughter of children disappears. The calls of merchants fade away. The footsteps of travelers become fewer with each passing day, until, eventually, silence becomes the loudest sound of all. Only weeks after the first infected ships reached Europe's ports, thriving cities began to transform into places almost beyond recognition. The bustling streets that had once symbolized prosperity now carried an atmosphere of fear. Every doorway concealed uncertainty. Every window hid anxious faces watching the world change before their eyes. The marketplace, once the beating heart of every medieval city, was among the first places to fall silent. Not long ago, these squares had overflowed with life. Farmers arrived before sunrise with baskets of vegetables, eggs, and freshly baked bread. Merchants shouted over one another, advertising fine wool from England, spices from the East, and colorful cloth from Italy. Horses pulled heavy wagons through crowded lanes while musicians entertained children chasing one another between the stalls. Now, wooden booths stood abandoned. Scattered vegetables rotted where they had been dropped days earlier. Empty barrels lay overturned, and torn pieces of cloth fluttered gently in the wind. Doors remained locked. No voices bargained over prices. No customers gathered to exchange news. The marketplace, once filled with the promise of another prosperous day, had become a place everyone feared to enter. People stayed inside their homes whenever they could, not because they felt safe, but because they had nowhere else to go. As fear spread through every neighborhood, churches became crowded in ways never seen before. From dawn until nightfall, frightened families gathered beneath towering stone arches, kneeling together in desperate prayer. Candles flickered endlessly before statues of saints. The smell of incense drifted through the air as priests pleaded for God's mercy. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Old men whispered confessions they had postponed for years. Even those who had rarely entered a church suddenly sought comfort within its walls. Many believed the plague was divine punishment. If humanity had angered God, perhaps only repentance could save them. Services grew longer. Prayers became more desperate. Voices echoed through magnificent cathedrals that could no longer contain the growing crowds. Yet even the churches were not spared. Priests visited the sick, heard final confessions, comforted grieving families, and buried the dead. Many never returned. One by one, clergymen also fell ill. Some collapsed while leading prayers. Others died only days after offering comfort to those already infected. Soon, even the places people trusted most became reminders that no one was beyond death's reach. Then came the bells. In medieval Europe, church bells marked the rhythm of daily life. They welcomed the sunrise. They announced weddings. They celebrated festivals. They called entire communities together. But during the plague, their purpose changed. Funeral bells rang in the morning. They rang again before noon. They rang throughout the afternoon. They echoed after sunset. Some chroniclers wrote that the bells seemed almost never to stop. Each slow toll announced another life lost, then another, then another. For those still alive, the sound became impossible to escape. Every family listened in silence, wondering whether the next bell would soon ring for someone they loved. Even the birds seemed to disappear. The familiar sounds of ordinary life faded beneath the endless tolling that drifted across rooftops day after day. As the number of deaths increased, entire streets emptied. Only weeks earlier, thousands of people had filled these narrow roads. Children played beside fountains. Craftsmen worked with open doors. Neighbors paused to exchange greetings from their windows. Now doors remained tightly shut. Wooden shutters covered windows. Many houses displayed simple markings warning others to stay away. Some families refused to answer even when relatives knocked. Others were unable to answer at all. A traveler walking through the city might hear nothing except the distant ringing of bells and the occasional creak of a swinging sign moved by the wind. The silence was unsettling, peaceful, but heavy, as though the city itself had stopped breathing. The smell changed as well. The pleasant aroma of fresh bread and roasted meat slowly vanished. In its place came the scent of sickness, damp stone, smoke, and death. As cemeteries filled beyond capacity, authorities struggled to deal with the growing number of bodies. Funeral processions that had once honored a single individual became hurried and brief. There was no longer enough time for elaborate ceremonies. Gravediggers worked until exhaustion overtook them. Coffins became scarce. Mass graves appeared outside city walls. In some regions, fires burned almost continuously as belongings from infected homes, and, in certain places and circumstances, the bodies of the dead were destroyed in desperate attempts to slow the spread of disease. Thick columns of smoke drifted above rooftops, darkening the sky and filling the air with the smell of ash. Whether these fires truly stopped the plague mattered little to those watching them. To frightened citizens, they looked like the final signs of a civilization trying to save itself. Day after day, the smoke continued to rise. It became part of the city's skyline, part of everyday life, part of everyone's memory. Those who remained alive no longer measured time by the calendar. They counted the empty houses on their street. They counted the funerals they attended. They counted the neighbors they had lost. Some stopped looking out their windows altogether, afraid they would recognize another cart carrying away someone they had known only yesterday. The plague had stolen more than lives. It had stolen routine. It had stolen certainty. It had stolen the simple belief that tomorrow would resemble today. For the first time in generations, people no longer feared war, famine, or invading armies above all else. They feared the silence outside their own front door. Because in a city where the markets no longer opened, where the churches overflowed with desperate prayers, where funeral bells never seemed to stop, and where smoke rose endlessly into the grey sky, silence itself had become the sound of death. History often remembers kings, battles, and great cities, but the Black Death was fought somewhere far quieter, behind a wooden door, around a small dining table, beside a single bed where an ordinary family waited and hoped. Imagine stepping inside a modest home in Europe during the spring of the plague. The room is dimly lit by a small fire struggling to stay alive. A loaf of bread sits on the table, smaller than yesterday's. A clay jug holds only a little water. Outside, the streets have grown strangely silent, interrupted only by the distant tolling of church bells. Inside, no one speaks very loudly. Not because they have nothing to say. Because everyone is listening for the sound they fear most, a cough. It begins almost unnoticed. The youngest son complains that he feels cold, even though the fire is burning. His mother places the back of her hand against his forehead. It feels unusually warm. She tells him to rest, believing he has caught an ordinary fever. His father says little. He has seen too many neighbors begin the same way. By morning, the boy can barely sit upright. The family closes the front door. They decide that no one will leave unless absolutely necessary. Perhaps they hope if they remain together inside the house, the illness will not spread. It is a decision born from love and from complete uncertainty. No one truly understands how the disease moves from one person to another. Some believe it drifts through poisoned air. Others blame foul smells rising from the streets. Some avoid touching strangers. Others burn herbs, flowers, or incense in every room, hoping the sweet smoke will cleanse the air. Windows are opened, then closed again. Blankets are washed repeatedly. Floors are swept. Every small action feels like a possible answer. Yet nothing brings certainty. As the days pass, another problem begins to grow. Food. The marketplace has closed. The baker no longer opens his shop every morning. Farmers are afraid to enter the city. Merchants have stopped arriving. Whatever food remains inside the house must last. The family divides every meal carefully. A small piece of bread for each person. A little dried cheese. Perhaps a bowl of thin vegetable broth if they are fortunate enough to have stored vegetables before the sickness arrived. No one eats until they are full. Parents quietly pretend they are not hungry so their children can have one more bite. No one complains. Hunger has become another member of the household. Meanwhile, the illness worsens. The boy's fever climbs higher. Painful swellings appear beneath his arm. His breathing becomes shallow. His mother rarely leaves his bedside. She wipes sweat from his forehead with damp cloths and whispers comforting words. Even when he no longer seems able to hear them, his father fetches water. His sister keeps the fire burning. Every member of the family does what little they can, not because they know it will help, but because doing nothing feels impossible. Every act of kindness carries invisible danger. A mother embraces her sick child. A husband lifts his exhausted wife into bed. A daughter holds her grandmother's trembling hand through the night. Today we recognize these as gestures of compassion. In the 14th century, they could also become acts of fatal sacrifice. Many families discovered this in the cruelest way imaginable. One person became ill. A few days later, another developed a fever, then another. Soon the entire household was waiting together, wondering who would be next. There were no doctors with effective medicine, no hospitals equipped to fight infection, no scientific explanation to guide them, only faith, hope, and love. Then came the decisions no family should ever have to make. Should they remain together and risk everyone becoming sick? Or should they separate, leaving someone they loved to face death alone. Some families locked themselves inside their homes, believing isolation might save others. Some sent healthy children to relatives in distant villages, praying they had left early enough. Others refused to leave the bedside of a dying parent, husband, wife, or child, knowing full well they might never walk out of that room alive. There was no right choice. Every decision carried heartbreak. Even after death came, the suffering often continued. Many people were too frightened to enter infected homes. Bodies sometimes remained inside for hours or even days before someone was willing to remove them. Neighbors who once shared meals and celebrated weddings together now passed the house without stopping, crossing to the opposite side of the street in fearful silence. The plague did more than attack the human body. It tested every bond between family members. It forced people to choose between survival and compassion, between self-preservation and love. And yet, despite the overwhelming fear, countless ordinary people continued caring for those they loved until the very end. They held hands that others refused to touch. They whispered prayers into silent rooms. They stayed beside beds where hope had almost disappeared. Those quiet moments would never appear in royal chronicles or official records, but they became the true story of the Black Death. For behind every statistic, behind every abandoned street, behind every ringing church bell, was an ordinary home where a family, just like millions of others, was trying to hold on to one another while the world outside slowly fell apart. When the plague swept across Europe, people looked to those they believed possessed the greatest knowledge. The physicians. Surely, if anyone could understand this mysterious illness, it would be the men who had spent years studying medicine. Surely, they would know how to stop it. But the truth was far more frightening. The doctors were almost as helpless as their patients. In the middle of the 14th century, medicine was built upon centuries of ancient traditions. Physicians studied the writings of Greek scholars like Hippocrates and Galen, believing that health depended on maintaining a delicate balance between the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease, they believed, appeared when that balance was disturbed. The theory had guided medical practice for generations. Few questioned it. There was one problem. The Black Death followed none of its rules. Doctors visited homes carrying leather bags filled with knives, herbs, glass bottles, and handwritten manuscripts. They carefully examined their patients, feeling foreheads, checking pulses, and studying the strange swellings beneath the skin. They searched desperately for patterns. Why did one healthy young man die within 3 days while an elderly woman survived? Why did entire families perish while a neighboring household remained untouched? Why did the disease seem to leap from street to street without warning? No answer ever came. Without microscopes, without knowledge of bacteria, and without any understanding of germs, physicians could only explain the plague through the ideas available to them. One explanation became especially popular. The air itself had become poisoned. Known as the theory of bad air, or miasma, many believed invisible clouds of corruption floated through cities, created by rotting waste, foul smells, swamps, or even unusual movements in the heavens. People noticed that plague-ridden neighborhoods smelled terrible. They assumed the smell caused the disease. In reality, the smell was only a tragic companion to death. But to medieval physicians, the conclusion seemed logical. If bad air caused illness, then clean, pleasant smells might prevent it. Homes were filled with fragrant herbs. Juniper branches burned slowly in fireplaces. Rosemary, lavender, sage, and thyme were scattered across floors. Incense drifted through churches. Perfumes were carried in small containers around the neck. Some wealthy citizens even walked the streets holding flowers close to their noses, hoping every breath of sweet fragrance might protect them from invisible poison. The scent may have brought comfort. It brought no cure. Doctors also relied upon one of the oldest treatments in medieval medicine: bloodletting. According to the medical beliefs of the time, removing blood could restore balance inside the body and drive illness away. Physicians opened veins using sharp blades or allowed leeches to feed upon their patients. Already weakened by infection, many victims lost even more strength. The disease continued its relentless march. Some doctors prescribed elaborate mixtures of herbs mixed with wine or vinegar. Others ground precious stones into expensive powders. Rare spices from distant lands were sold at extraordinary prices because people believed they possessed healing powers. Apothecaries worked day and night preparing remedies for frightened families. Hope was often the most valuable ingredient they offered, not because the medicines worked, but because desperate people needed something to believe in. As deaths increased, physicians themselves became frightened. Many refused to visit infected homes. Others continued their work despite knowing the danger. Every house call might become their last. Contrary to popular imagination, the famous plague doctor's costume with its long black robe and bird-like beaked mask was not commonly worn during the first wave of the Black Death in the 14th century. That distinctive outfit appeared centuries later, particularly during outbreaks in the 17th century. The hollow beak was filled with aromatic herbs, spices and flowers, because doctors believed these pleasant scents filtered out poisonous air before it reached their lungs. The image has become one of history's most recognizable symbols, yet it belongs to a later chapter of Europe's long struggle with plague. The physicians who faced the first Black Death looked much like other educated men of their age. Their greatest protection was not a strange mask. It was courage. Many entered houses everyone else avoided. They listened to frightened families. They examined the dying. They comforted those whose final hours had already begun. Some survived. Many did not. Even the most respected doctors watched patient after patient slip beyond their reach. No prayer, no herbal mixture, no carefully measured incision could halt the disease. Each failure deepened the growing despair across Europe. For ordinary people, the realization was devastating. If the doctors could not save them, who could? Trust slowly began to crumble. Families turned instead to wandering healers, miracle cures, traveling monks, astrologers, and anyone claiming to possess secret knowledge. Strange remedies spread through towns almost as quickly as the plague itself. Some drank mixtures that made them even sicker. Others carried charms or amulets, convinced they possessed magical protection. Fear made almost every promise sound believable. But the plague cared nothing for reputation, wealth, education, or confidence. It ignored titles. It ignored experience. It ignored centuries of medical learning. The greatest minds of medieval Europe stood face to face with an invisible enemy they could neither understand nor defeat. And as doctors exhausted every treatment they knew, another question began to haunt the continent. If medicine had failed, was this disaster beyond human control altogether? When medicine failed, people turned to heaven. For centuries, faith had been at the center of medieval life. The church marked every stage of existence from birth to marriage, from harvest celebrations to funeral rites. It explained the changing seasons, offered comfort during hardship, and promised eternal life beyond death. Now, as the plague spread from town to town, that faith would face its greatest test. Each morning, long before the sun had fully risen, church doors opened to crowds unlike any seen before. Men, women, and children gathered shoulder to shoulder beneath towering stone ceilings. Candles flickered in the darkness, casting trembling shadows across ancient walls. The scent of incense filled the air as voices rose together in desperate prayer. Some knelt for hours, others wept openly. Many prayed not for wealth or success, but simply for one more day of life. Priests preached that God had not abandoned humanity, even as death surrounded them. They urged their congregations to confess their sins, forgive their enemies, and prepare their souls for whatever lay ahead. The sound of whispered prayers became as common as the ringing of church bells. Our Father, Holy Mary, Lord, have mercy. The words echoed through every cathedral, monastery, and village chapel across Europe. For countless people, prayer was the only weapon they believed remained. As fear deepened, public religious processions became increasingly common. Entire communities poured into the streets carrying wooden crosses, sacred banners, and holy relics believed to possess miraculous power. Priests walked at the front, chanting ancient hymns while the crowd followed behind in solemn silence. People believed that if enough faithful hearts prayed together, perhaps God would hear them. Perhaps the plague would finally end. The processions wound slowly through marketplaces that had fallen silent, past shuttered homes and abandoned workshops. Families watched from their windows as the long lines of worshippers disappeared around narrow corners, their songs drifting through streets where laughter had once echoed. For a brief moment, the people did not feel alone, yet every new funeral seemed to raise another painful question. If so many prayers were being offered, why did the dying continue to multiply? As answers became harder to find, some believers embraced far more dramatic expressions of faith. Across parts of Europe, groups known as the Flagellants began traveling from town to town. They believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. If that were true, they reasoned, then only sincere repentance could earn divine forgiveness. Their solution was extraordinary. Barefoot and dressed in simple robes, they marched through city streets chanting hymns of repentance. At regular intervals they stopped, removed their upper garments and struck their own backs with leather whips embedded with small pieces of metal or bone. Blood stained their shoulders. Pain became a public prayer. The crowds watched in silence. Some joined them. Others fell to their knees. The Flagellants believed that by willingly suffering they could atone not only for their own sins, but for the sins of all humanity. They traveled hundreds of miles, repeating the same ritual, convinced each wound brought the world one step closer to mercy. To frightened communities, they appeared both inspiring and terrifying. Some saw them as holy men. Others believed they spread panic wherever they went. In time, church authorities themselves grew uneasy. These movements often acted without official approval, attracting enormous crowds, and sometimes challenging the authority of local clergy. Eventually, many rulers and religious leaders attempted to suppress them, but the desperation that had created the movement could not be so easily silenced. For ordinary families, faith became deeply personal. A mother lit a candle every evening beside the bed of her sick child. An old farmer whispered the same prayer before every sunrise, grateful simply to have awakened once more. A widow attended Mass each morning, even after burying her husband, believing she would see him again in the next life. These quiet acts rarely appeared in historical records, yet they sustained millions of people through unimaginable grief. Not everyone found comfort. Some questioned why innocent children were dying while cruel men survived. Others wondered whether God had turned away from the world altogether. A few abandoned hope completely, but many discovered something remarkable. even when answers could not be found. Faith gave them the strength to endure another day. Hope and despair walked side by side through every village and city. A funeral ended. A baptism followed. One family mourned. Another welcomed the birth of a child. Church bells rang for the dead, then rang again for morning prayer. Life refused to disappear entirely. The Black Death challenged every certainty medieval Europe possessed. It shook kingdoms, emptied cities, and humbled physicians. Yet perhaps no institution was tested more severely than religion itself. Some people emerged with stronger faith, others with painful doubts. Most carried both at the same time, because, in a world where no doctor could promise tomorrow, where every sunrise might be someone's last, and where death seemed to stand at every doorway, hope was no longer the belief that everything would be all right. Hope became the courage to keep praying, even when heaven remained silent. The Black Death did not only empty cities, it emptied homes. Behind every number recorded in history was a family that would never be whole again. Behind every church bell that tolled for the dead was a table, where one chair would remain forever empty. While kings counted the loss of their kingdoms, and merchants counted the loss of their fortunes, ordinary people counted something far more precious, the faces of those they loved. In countless villages across Europe, the plague arrived without warning. One evening, a family gathered around a simple meal of bread and soup. They spoke about the coming harvest, repaired worn clothing by the fire, and thanked God for another ordinary day. A week later, half of them were gone. The disease spread so quickly that many households had little time to prepare for what was happening. A father developed a fever on Monday. His wife became ill 2 days later. Before the children could understand what was happening, both parents were too weak to leave their beds. The familiar voices that had filled the house every morning slowly faded into silence. For children, the plague was especially cruel. Many watched helplessly as their mothers struggled to breathe or their fathers drifted in and out of consciousness. There were no medicines capable of saving them. No doctor could promise recovery. All a frightened child could do was hold a parent's hand and hope they would open their eyes once more. Sometimes they never did. Across Europe, thousands of children suddenly found themselves alone. Some wandered through empty homes calling for parents who would never answer. Others sat quietly beside lifeless bodies, too young to understand that death had already taken the people they loved most. Neighbors who might once have rushed to help now hesitated. Fear had changed everything. Many adults were terrified that entering an infected house meant inviting death into their own family. Some still chose compassion. Others simply could not overcome their fear. The plague forced ordinary people into impossible choices. Parents faced their own heartbreak. Imagine a mother realizing she has begun to feel the same burning fever that claimed her husband only days before. Her first thought is not for herself. It is for her children. Should she keep them close, offering comfort during what might be her final hours? Or should she send them away immediately, hoping they might escape the illness? Many mothers and fathers made the painful decision to separate from their children. Praying distance might accomplish what medicine could not. Some children survived because of those choices. Many never saw their parents again. Throughout Europe, orphan children became an increasingly common sight. Churches, monasteries, and charitable communities struggled to care for them, but the number of children without families grew faster than anyone could manage. Older brothers suddenly became guardians of younger sisters. Teenagers who had never imagined adulthood found themselves responsible for entire households. Childhood ended overnight. In many homes, there was no one left to teach, protect, or comfort them. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking stories involved those who were still alive. As fear intensified, some families made decisions they never believed themselves capable of making. A husband noticed his wife had developed swollen glands beneath her arms. A daughter began coughing violently through the night. An elderly grandfather could no longer rise from his bed. Everyone understood what those signs might mean, and everyone understood the danger of remaining nearby. Contemporary chroniclers describe terrible moments in which frightened relatives fled infected houses, leaving the sick behind in desperate hopes of saving the rest of the family. In some towns, neighbors barred their doors against anyone showing symptoms. Servants abandoned employers. Even lifelong friendships sometimes dissolved beneath the overwhelming instinct to survive. These stories are painful to read, but they are also deeply human. Most people were not acting from cruelty, they were acting from terror. They had watched healthy neighbors die within days. They had seen entire households disappear. They believed that staying beside a loved one might condemn everyone else inside the home. There was no easy answer. Yet countless others chose differently. Across Europe, fathers remained beside dying sons. Daughters cared for aging parents until the very end. Brothers buried brothers. Wives refused to leave husbands despite knowing they might soon share the same fate. These quiet acts of love rarely appeared in official records. But they became some of the greatest acts of courage during the plague. Every family carried its own story. Some survived almost untouched. Others lost generations within a single month. There were villages where only a handful of people remained alive to remember the names of those who had vanished. There were homes where children's toys lay exactly where they had been left, waiting for hands that would never return. There were dinner tables forever missing familiar voices. The Black Death destroyed more than lives. It shattered the invisible bonds that held medieval society together. It forced parents to make impossible decisions. It turned children into orphans. It transformed love into sacrifice and fear into painful separation. Yet even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion never disappeared completely. Behind closed doors, away from the eyes of history, ordinary people continued to hold trembling hands, whisper final prayers, and offer comfort to those taking their last breath. Those moments remind us that while the plague claimed millions of lives, it never completely extinguished the humanity of the people who endured it. And in the midst of unimaginable loss, the greatest battle was not only against death, it was against the fear of losing one another before the end had even come. As the plague spread across Europe, death began to move faster than the living could keep pace. At first, every funeral followed the traditions people had known for generations. Family members gathered to pray. Neighbors carried the coffin. Church bells rang with quiet dignity. A priest spoke gentle words over the grave before loved ones said their final farewell. Death had always been a deeply personal moment, but the Black Death changed even that. Within months, the number of people dying each day became so overwhelming that many towns simply could not bury them fast enough. Cemeteries filled rapidly. Fresh graves appeared beside older ones until every available space seemed occupied. The dead kept arriving. The earth could not open quickly enough. Those responsible for burying the dead suddenly found themselves facing an impossible task. Gravediggers became some of the busiest people in Europe. Every sunrise brought another list of homes to visit. Every evening ended with aching muscles and exhausted minds. The work never truly stopped. Many had once been ordinary laborers, farmers or craftsmen. Now they carried shovels instead of tools, spending their days digging into hard ground from dawn until long after sunset. Few celebrated their work, yet without them entire cities would have descended into even greater chaos. The danger they faced was enormous. Day after day, they entered neighborhoods everyone else avoided. They walked into homes where entire families had perished. They lifted bodies with little understanding of how disease spread, knowing only that many who handled the dead eventually became sick themselves. Every cart they loaded, every grave they dug, every burial they completed, might become the reason they never returned home. Still, someone had to do it. As deaths continued to rise, funeral customs grew shorter and simpler. There was rarely enough time for lengthy ceremonies. Many families could no longer gather together. Some were already ill. Others were too frightened to attend. Priests hurried from one burial to the next, offering brief prayers before moving on to another grieving household waiting nearby. The familiar rhythm of mourning disappeared beneath the relentless pace of survival. Soon, even individual graves became impossible in many places. Large burial pits were dug outside city walls. Deep trenches stretched across open ground, prepared to receive dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. One by one carts arrived. The dead were placed carefully into the earth as space allowed. Layers of soil covered them before another row was added above. These mass graves were not created because people had forgotten compassion. They were created because there was no longer enough time, space, or strength to bury everyone individually. It was a heartbreaking necessity. Across many towns, another familiar sight became part of daily life: the carts. From early morning until nightfall, wooden wagons creaked slowly through narrow streets. Drawn by tired horses, they stopped outside homes where someone had died during the night. Workers knocked on doors that no one answered. Sometimes survivors silently laid the body outside. Sometimes there was no one left alive inside the house. The wagon moved on. Then another stop. Then another. Hour after hour, day after day. For many citizens, the sound of wooden wheels against cobblestones became one of the defining memories of the plague. Looking through a window and seeing another cart pass was enough to fill an entire household with dread. Who had died this time? A neighbor, a friend, someone from their own family. No one wanted to find out. The men and women who performed this grim work rarely received praise. People often avoided them, fearing they carried the plague wherever they went. Children crossed the street when they approached. Shopkeepers served them cautiously. Even after their work ended for the day, many found themselves isolated from the communities they were helping to protect. Yet they continued, without recognition, without certainty, without knowing whether tomorrow they would become passengers on the very carts they pushed. History remembers kings who led armies and rulers who built great cities, but it rarely remembers the ordinary people who carried the dead when no one else could. The gravediggers asked for no glory, they simply kept digging. They worked through exhaustion, grief, and constant fear because civilization itself depended on someone remaining strong enough to perform the final act of kindness for those who could no longer speak for themselves. As the burial pits grew larger and the funeral carts rolled endlessly through Europe's silent streets, one painful truth became impossible to ignore. The plague was no longer measured by the number of people falling ill. It was measured by the number of graves that had to be dug before another sunrise. And still, the carts kept coming. The plague did not only take lives, it also stole the simple certainty that there would be food on tomorrow's table. In medieval Europe, survival depended upon the rhythm of the seasons. Every spring brought planting. Every summer demanded endless hours of labor beneath the sun. Autumn was the time of harvest, and winter was endured with whatever had been carefully stored away. For generations this cycle had rarely changed, but the Black Death shattered it. As villages emptied and cities fell silent, the fields beyond their walls were left untended. Wheat ripened beneath the summer sun with no one to harvest it. Barley swayed in the wind until heavy heads of grain bent to the ground and slowly rotted where they stood. Nature continued its work. Humanity could not. Across the countryside, the familiar sounds of farming began to disappear. The creak of wooden plows, the calls of workers across open fields, and the steady rhythm of sickles cutting grain grew strangely quiet. There were simply too few hands left. Some farmers had died. Others were caring for sick relatives. Many were too frightened to leave their homes. Entire families who had cultivated the same land for generations vanished within a single season, leaving behind cottages with open doors and fields that no one would sow again. The plague was claiming more than people. It was claiming the harvest itself. Animals suffered as well. Cattle wandered through neglected pastures searching for water. Sheep remained unshorn as their shepherds disappeared. Chickens scattered around abandoned farmyards, while horses stood untethered beside empty barns. Some animals escaped into nearby forests. Others died where they had been left. Without enough healthy people to feed, shelter, and care for livestock, the countryside slowly slipped into disorder. The loss of animals created another crisis. Oxen that once pulled heavy plows were gone. Cows no longer provided milk for nearby villages. Fewer chickens meant fewer eggs. Every missing animal made the shortage of food even worse. In the cities, the effects became impossible to ignore. Bread, the foundation of nearly every meal, grew increasingly scarce. Each morning, people gathered outside the few bakeries that still opened their doors, hoping supplies had arrived during the night. Some waited for hours. Many returned home empty-handed. Those fortunate enough to purchase a loaf carried it carefully through deserted streets, knowing it might have to feed an entire family for days. The familiar comfort of fresh bread became a rare luxury. As supplies dwindled, prices climbed relentlessly. Grain became more valuable than many ordinary workers could afford. Meat almost disappeared from local markets. Cheese, butter, and dried fish became precious commodities reserved for those with money or fortunate connections. For poor families, every trip to the market brought the same painful question. Should they spend their last coins today, or save them for tomorrow, hoping prices would somehow fall? Usually they only rose higher. Merchants faced impossible choices of their own. Trade routes had been disrupted by fear and disease. Many ships never completed their journeys. Caravans turned back before reaching infected towns. Even when food was available elsewhere, there were too healthy workers to transport it safely across Europe. The shelves emptied. The wagons stopped arriving. Hunger quietly followed the plague into every community. Inside ordinary homes, meals became smaller with each passing week. A bowl of thin soup was stretched to feed 6 people instead of 3. Stale bread was softened in water so nothing would be wasted. Families carefully scraped every remaining grain from storage sacks. Nothing edible was thrown away. Parents quietly skipped meals, pretending they had already eaten so their children could have one more piece of bread. Elderly grandparents insisted they were not hungry, even when their stomachs ached from days of eating almost nothing. Love was measured in sacrifices no one spoke about. As desperation grew, people searched for nourishment wherever they could find it. Wild herbs were gathered from roadsides. Nuts and berries were collected from nearby forests. Roots were dug from the earth. Whatever could be boiled, roasted, or chewed became part of the day's meal. For many families, the question was no longer what tasted good. It was simply, what could keep them alive until tomorrow? Yet even hunger could not stop the plague. Weak bodies, already exhausted by poor nutrition, found it even harder to resist disease. Every missed meal left people more vulnerable. Every failed harvest deepened the crisis. The Black Death had begun as a deadly illness. Now it had become something even larger. A collapse of everyday life itself. Fields stood empty. Barns fell silent. Bakery ovens grew cold. Dinner tables welcomed fewer voices with every passing week. And across Europe, millions of ordinary people learned that surviving the plague required more than escaping disease. It also meant enduring the slow, relentless hunger that followed in its shadow. For when death walked through the land, it rarely traveled alone. Fear does not always remain fear. Sometimes it becomes suspicion, then hatred, and finally violence. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, people searched desperately for answers. Every day brought more funerals. Every week another village seemed to disappear. The disease spared no kingdom, no profession, and no social class. Physicians could not explain it. Priests could not stop it. Kings could not control it. When no one understands why tragedy is happening, human nature often searches for someone to blame. Rumors spread through medieval Europe far faster than any messenger on horseback. One traveler claimed an entire town had been poisoned. Another insisted mysterious strangers had brought the disease. A frightened merchant swore he had heard that certain communities possessed secret knowledge about the plague. With every retelling, the stories grew more frightening and more dangerous. In an age without newspapers, scientific knowledge, or reliable communication, gossip became accepted as truth. A single whispered accusation in a crowded marketplace could travel across hundreds of miles within weeks. People wanted explanations. Even false ones felt better than having none at all. Among the communities that suffered most were Europe's Jewish populations. For centuries, Jewish communities had lived alongside their Christian neighbors in many towns and cities. They were merchants, craftsmen, scholars, physicians, and families trying to build ordinary lives. Like everyone else, they also fell victim to the plague, but fear rarely follows reason. As the death toll rose, malicious rumors began to spread that Jewish communities had poisoned wells in an attempt to destroy Christian society. There was no evidence for these accusations. Modern historians agree that these claims were entirely false, born from panic, prejudice, and the desperate search for a scapegoat. Yet frightened people were willing to believe almost anything. One accusation became another. One rumor became a certainty. Soon suspicion turned into fury. Crowds gathered outside Jewish neighborhoods demanding punishment for crimes that had never been committed. Homes were attacked. Synagogues were burned. Families who had already been living in fear of the plague suddenly found themselves fleeing from their own neighbors. In some cities, local rulers attempted to protect Jewish communities. Others remained silent. And in far too many places, violence was allowed to continue. Entire Jewish communities were destroyed in massacres that claimed thousands of innocent lives. Some families escaped to neighboring kingdoms seeking safety. Others had nowhere left to run. The plague was no longer the only killer. Human fear had become another. Nor were Jewish communities the only victims of suspicion. Foreign merchants, wandering travelers, beggars, and outsiders of every kind increasingly faced distrust. Anyone who looked different, spoke another language, or had arrived from another region could suddenly become the target of fearful whispers. Even neighbors who had known one another for years began to wonder who had brought the disease, who would be next. Trust, once the foundation of every community, slowly crumbled. Markets that had once welcomed strangers became places of suspicion. Doors remained locked. Windows stayed closed. People crossed the street rather than greet familiar faces. The plague had infected something deeper than the human body. It had infected society itself. Violence spread because fear is contagious. One act of cruelty inspired another. One false accusation encouraged dozens more. Communities that had survived together through wars, harsh winters, and famine suddenly found themselves divided by suspicion. Meanwhile, the plague continued without mercy. It did not care about religion. It did not distinguish between Christian and Jewish, between noble and peasant, between innocent and guilty. The same invisible bacteria that entered a poor cottage also entered a wealthy palace. The same disease that claimed a merchant's child claimed the child of a king. Yet even as history recorded these dark moments, it also preserved quieter stories of courage. Some Christian families hid their Jewish neighbors from violent mobs. Certain bishops publicly condemned the false accusations. A number of local rulers risked their own authority to protect innocent lives, insisting that justice could not be built upon fear and lies. These acts did not stop every tragedy, but they remind us that compassion survived, even in an age overwhelmed by terror. The Black Death exposed both the worst and the best of humanity. It revealed how easily panic can become hatred, how quickly rumors can become weapons, and how dangerous it is when fear is allowed to speak louder than truth. Long after the plague itself had faded, the wounds left by these acts of violence remained, not only in burned homes or abandoned neighborhoods, but in the memories of generations who learned that during history's darkest hours, the deadliest enemy is not always disease. Sometimes, it is the fear we allow to rule our hearts. When the Black Death arrived, it did not ask whether a person was rich or poor. It entered castles. It entered cottages. It crossed city walls and country roads without hesitation. Yet while the plague threatened everyone, not everyone faced it under the same circumstances. For Europe is wealthy, money could buy one precious thing: time. As rumors of the disease spread from one city to the next, many nobles, wealthy merchants, and influential families gathered their belongings and left before the sickness reached its peak. Carriages rolled out through city gates carrying servants, furniture, valuable documents, and enough food to last for weeks. They traveled toward country estates, isolated manors, and remote castles, hoping that distance alone would keep death away. The countryside seemed safer, the air was fresher. The villages were smaller, there were fewer strangers and less crowded streets. Many believed that escaping the city meant escaping the plague itself. For a while, some did. Behind the walls of great manor houses, life continued with surprising normality. Meals still served in grand halls. Fires burned warmly in stone fireplaces. Servants tended gardens and livestock, while their employers waited anxiously for news from distant towns. Letters arrived describing cities filled with funerals and silent marketplaces. The nobles read them with growing unease. But they also believed they had made the right decision. Meanwhile, inside Europe's crowded cities, millions of ordinary people had no such choice. A blacksmith could not simply abandon his forge. A baker could not leave his oven. A widow living in a single rented room had nowhere else to go. For laborers, craftsmen, servants, and the poor, escaping required something they did not possess: resources. Most families owned little more than the clothes they wore, a few pieces of furniture, and enough food to survive from one week to the next. Leaving the city meant abandoning everything they had worked their entire lives to build. Even if they wished to flee, where could they go? Many villagers refused to accept strangers, fearing they might carry the disease. Roads became increasingly dangerous. Food was scarce. Travel itself could expose people to infection. So countless families remained where they were, hoping the plague might somehow pass them by. Hope became their only shelter. As the months wore on, the difference between wealth and poverty became impossible to ignore. The wealthy often had larger homes where family members could isolate from one another more easily. They had servants to fetch supplies, private wells for cleaner water, and stored food that reduced the need to visit crowded markets. The poor shared tiny rooms with entire families. Several generations sometimes slept beneath the same roof. Neighbors lived only a few steps away. Privacy was almost impossible. So was isolation. Every cough echoed through the household. Every fever threatened everyone inside. And yet, despite these differences, the plague continued to defy human expectations. Country estates that seemed like safe havens eventually reported deaths of their own. Servants carried supplies between villages. Travelers unknowingly brought infected fleas hidden among cargo. Visitors arrived seeking refuge. The disease followed. Castle gates could not stop it. Stone walls could not stop it. Gold could not stop it. Some of Europe's most powerful nobles watched members of their own families fall ill despite every precaution they had taken. Wealth purchased comfort, but it could not purchase immunity. The plague reminded rulers of something they rarely considered. Power has limits. Likewise, some among the poor survived against all odds. Entire families living in cramped neighborhoods escaped infection while wealthier households perished. No one could explain why. Without understanding how the disease spread, survival often appeared almost random. One street lost nearly everyone. The next lost only a few. One brother died, another lived. One noble family vanished. A poor farmer continued working his field. The plague ignored the rules society believed were unbreakable. As death reached every level of medieval life, old assumptions began to crumble. People who had once believed wealth guaranteed security discovered that money could not command nature. Those who had always looked upward with envy now saw that fear haunted castles as deeply as cottages. The difference between rich and poor remained real. But before the Black Death, both stood equally helpless. The disease stripped away many illusions. It reminded Europe that beneath fine clothing and rough wool, beneath jeweled crowns and worn leather boots, every human heart beat with the same fragile rhythm. Every family loved. Every family feared. Every family mourned. When the funeral bells rang across the continent, they did not ring only for peasants. They rang for merchants, for priests, for craftsmen, for queens, for kings. The Black Death became one of the few moments in history when the boundaries that divided medieval society suddenly seemed smaller than the invisible enemy that threatened them all. Because in the end, neither poverty nor privilege could promise another sunrise. And before the plague finally passed, Europe would learn that death was the only visitor who treated every door as equal. History often tells the story of the Black Death through kings, physicians, merchants, and priests. But there was another generation whose voices were rarely written into the Chronicles, the children. For them, the plague was not a lesson in history, it was the world they grew up in. Many were too young to understand why their parents suddenly stopped speaking, why neighbors disappeared one by one, or why the church bells seemed to ring every single day. They could not grasp the meaning of disease or death. They only knew that the people they loved were no longer there, A familiar hand that once tucked them into bed each night was suddenly gone. A mother's gentle voice faded into silence. A father's footsteps never returned through the front door. For countless children across Europe, childhood ended long before it should have. In village after village, the plague left homes standing but families broken. A small wooden toy remained on the floor where it had been dropped. A half-finished meal sat untouched on the table. Beds that had once been filled with laughter now stood empty. The house was still there, but the family was not. Many children became orphans almost overnight. Some lost only one parent, others lost everyone. Brothers, sisters, grandparents, aunts, uncles, entire family trees seemed to disappear within a matter of weeks. Those fortunate enough to have surviving relatives were often taken in by uncles, grandparents, or older siblings struggling to survive themselves. Others had nowhere to go. Across much of Europe, monasteries and convents became places of refuge. These religious communities were already accustomed to caring for the poor, the sick, and travelers. Now, they opened their doors to children who had lost everything. Life inside a monastery was quiet and disciplined. The days followed a steady rhythm. The ringing of bells marked the hours of prayer. Simple meals were shared in silence. Children learned to read prayers, tend gardens, fetch water, and help with daily chores. Older monks and nuns offered guidance, patience, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of stability in a world that had become frighteningly unpredictable. It was not a replacement for a family, but for many children, it was the closest thing they had left. Not every orphan found such shelter. Some survived by working wherever they could. A boy who had once expected to inherit his father's farm now worked as a servant in another village. A young girl who had spent her days playing beside her mother suddenly found herself cooking, cleaning, and caring for younger children. The responsibilities of adulthood arrived years too early. There was little time to grieve. Survival demanded action. These children learned lessons no one should have to learn so young. How to bury a loved one, how to stretch a small piece of bread across several days, how to comfort a younger brother while hiding their own fear. How to wake each morning not knowing whether anyone else they cared about would still be alive by nightfall. The plague stole more than their parents. It stole their innocence. And yet, children possess a remarkable ability to adapt. Even in the darkest years of the epidemic, life slowly found ways to continue. Games returned to village squares where enough children remained. Laughter, though quieter than before, could still be heard between monastery walls. Friendships formed among orphans who understood one another's loss without needing many words. Hope, fragile as it was, survived. As the years passed, and the plague gradually loosened its grip, these children became the adults who would rebuild Europe. They inherited abandoned farms, empty workshops, and villages that needed new life. They became farmers, craftsmen, merchants, mothers, fathers, and leaders. But they carried invisible memories that never left them. They remembered the silence, the funeral bells, the empty chairs at the family table, the fear that had shaped every ordinary day. Their generation viewed the world differently from those who had come before. They had learned that life could change overnight, that wealth offered no certainty, that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Those lessons remained with them long after the plague had faded into history. In many ways, Europe itself was rebuilt by children who had been forced to grow up too soon. They carried both grief and resilience into a new age. The scars of the Black Death could not always be seen, but they lived on in the hearts of those who had survived it as children. For every abandoned home eventually welcomed a new family. Every empty field was planted once more. Every silent village slowly found its voice again. Yet the generation that had watched the world collapse during childhood would never completely forget what it had cost. They were not only the survivors of the Black Death. They became the generation that carried its memory into the future, ensuring that the echoes of those dark years would never be entirely lost. No one could say exactly when the nightmare began to loosen its grip. There was no single morning when a messenger rode into town announcing that the plague was over. No church bell rang in celebration. No king proclaimed victory. Instead, the end came quietly, almost as quietly as the plague itself had arrived. After years of relentless loss, something began to change. The funeral carts appeared less often. Church bells still rang for the dead, but no longer from dawn until nightfall. Physicians who had grown accustomed to visiting dozens of patients each day found fewer doors marked by sickness. Families who had spent months trapped inside their homes cautiously opened their windows once more. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was room to breathe. No one understood why the disease was retreating. Modern historians believe several factors likely contributed. The epidemic had already swept through vast populations, leaving fewer susceptible people behind in many areas. Changes in seasons, shifts in rat populations, and the natural ebb and flow of outbreaks also played important roles. But to the people of the 14th century, the reason remained a mystery. Some believed their prayers had finally been answered. Others thought God had shown mercy. Many simply thanked heaven that they had lived long enough to witness another spring. Slowly, the great cities of Europe began to awaken. The heavy wooden shutters that had remained closed for months were pushed open. Sunlight entered homes that had known little except grief. Merchants cautiously returned to market squares carrying whatever goods they could still sell. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn once again, and the comforting smell of fresh bread drifted through streets that had forgotten such ordinary pleasures. Children emerged from behind locked doors. Their laughter sounded unfamiliar, almost surprising. People paused in silence, smiling at a sound they had feared might never return. Churches, once overflowing with desperate prayers for survival, now welcomed congregations offering quiet thanks. Candles still burned before the altars, but their meaning had changed. They were no longer lit only for those who were dying. They were lit for those who had survived. Across the countryside, farmers returned to fields that had been abandoned for seasons. Many found nature had quietly reclaimed the land. Weeds covered forgotten gardens. Stone walls had begun to crumble. Fruit trees, left untended, grew wild and heavy with branches. It was as though the earth had continued living while humanity stood still. With patient hands, survivors began again. They repaired fences. They sharpened worn tools. They sowed seeds into soil that had not felt a plow in years. Every harvest became more than food. It became proof that life could return. Yet everywhere they looked, reminders of the plague remained. Some villages welcomed back only a handful of familiar faces. Neighbors searched for friends who would never return. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their roofs slowly collapsing beneath wind and rain. Wells remained untouched. Chapels echoed with silence. There were places where no one came back at all. Entire villages disappeared from the map of Europe. Some had lost every inhabitant. Others were abandoned because too few survivors remained to rebuild. Over time, forests swallowed roads once traveled by merchants. Fields became meadows. Nature quietly erased the signs that people had ever lived there. Only scattered stone foundations and forgotten cemeteries hinted at the lives that had once filled those places with laughter. The survivors carried a different burden. They had escaped death, but not memory. Every familiar street reminded someone of a lost brother. Every church pew held the absence of a beloved mother. Every family meal included empty places that could never truly be filled. The plague had ended. Grief had not. Still, human beings possess an extraordinary ability to rebuild. Workshops reopened. New apprentices learned forgotten trades. Children were born into a world slowly healing from unimaginable loss. Communities welcomed strangers, encouraging them to settle abandoned lands and revive deserted towns. Opportunities emerged where tragedy had left empty spaces. Farmers who survived often found more land available to cultivate. Skilled workers became increasingly valuable because there were so few of them left. Europe itself was beginning to change. The continent that emerged from the Black Death would not be the same one that had entered it. Old social structures weakened. Labor became more valuable. Survivors questioned traditions that had once seemed unshakable. In countless small ways, the plague reshaped the future long after the disease had faded. Yet none of these changes erased the sorrow of those years. Even decades later, grandparents would tell children about the time when streets stood empty, church bells never stopped ringing, and death seemed to visit every home. The memories became stories. The stories became history. And history became a warning, because the greatest scars left by the Black Death were not carved into stone walls or written in royal records. They lived within the hearts of those who had survived. As Europe slowly found its voice again, one truth remained impossible to ignore. The worst years were finally over, but the world that had emerged from them would never breathe in quite the same way again. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, Europe was still standing. Its kingdoms remained. Its churches still reached toward the sky. Its castles still crowned the hills. But beneath those familiar landmarks, nothing was quite the same. The plague had taken millions of lives, yet its greatest legacy was not measured only in graves. It reshaped the future of an entire continent. Across Europe, there was one problem that every village, every town, and every kingdom now faced. There were not enough people. Fields stretched across the countryside with no farmers to cultivate them. Vineyards stood untended. Workshops fell silent because there were no apprentices left to learn the trade. Blacksmiths, carpenters, millers, and stonemasons had disappeared in astonishing numbers. For centuries, labor had been plentiful. Now, it had become one of the rarest resources in Europe. Landowners who once commanded hundreds of workers suddenly struggled to find even a handful willing to harvest their crops. Noble estates that had produced enormous harvests before the plague now watched grain rot in the fields, because there simply were not enough hands to gather it. The balance of power was beginning to shift. For the first time in generations, ordinary workers found themselves in an unexpected position. They were needed. A farmer who survived the plague could negotiate for better land. A skilled carpenter could demand higher wages. A shepherd could choose which estate offered the best conditions. Work that once been taken for granted suddenly possessed tremendous value. Throughout many parts of Europe, wages began to rise. Employers competed for workers instead of the other way around. Laborers who had spent their entire lives obeying the demands of powerful landowners discovered that their skills could no longer be easily replaced. Not every ruler welcomed this change. Some kings and nobles attempted to freeze wages by law, hoping to restore the old order. Others tried to force peasants back into traditional obligations. But history had already begun moving in a different direction. It is difficult to command people who know they are indispensable. The plague had quietly weakened one of medieval Europe's oldest foundations, feudalism. For centuries, much of society had rested upon a rigid hierarchy. Kings granted land to nobles. Nobles controlled vast estates worked by peasants who often possessed little freedom to choose where they lived or whom they served. That system depended upon one simple assumption: there would always be enough workers. The Black Death shattered that assumption forever. As labor became scarce, many peasants gained opportunities their parents could never have imagined. Some negotiated lower rents. Others moved to towns in search of better wages. Entire families left estates where their ancestors had lived for generations, knowing another landlord would gladly welcome them. Freedom, once almost impossible to obtain, slowly became more attainable. The old feudal world did not disappear overnight, but its foundations had begun to crack. The economy changed alongside society. Trade gradually recovered, but it returned to a different Europe. Surviving merchants expanded into markets left vacant by competitors who had died. Craftsmen inherited abandoned workshops. Families acquired land that had once belonged to neighbors who never returned. Opportunity emerged from tragedy. It was an uncomfortable truth. For every empty house, someone eventually moved in. For every abandoned business, someone eventually reopened the door. The continent slowly rebuilt itself, but it did so in ways no one could have predicted before the plague. Over the following generations, a growing group of merchants, skilled artisans, bankers, and independent craftsmen accumulated wealth and influence. They were neither peasants nor powerful nobles. They became something increasingly important: a middle class. Their businesses connected cities through trade. Their investments financed new ideas. Their growing prosperity challenged the old belief that birth alone determined a person's place in society. The seeds of a new Europe had been planted. Many historians believe the profound social and economic changes that followed the Black Death helped prepare the way for the Renaissance, a period of extraordinary creativity, scientific curiosity, and cultural renewal that would transform Europe over the centuries to come. Ironically, one of history's darkest disasters helped create the conditions for one of history's brightest ages. Yet, no economic transformation could erase the human cost. Every higher wage carried the memory of someone who was no longer there to earn it. Every abandoned farm told the story of a family that had vanished. Every opportunity had been purchased at an unimaginable price. The Black Death did not simply reduce Europe's population. It changed how people viewed work. It changed how wealth was earned. It changed the relationship between rulers and ordinary people. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded an entire civilization that even the oldest institutions, the strongest kingdoms, and the most powerful traditions could be transformed in just a few devastating years. The plague had taken millions of lives. From its ashes, a different Europe slowly began to emerge. Not the Europe that had existed before, but the Europe that would shape the modern world. The Black Death left behind more than empty villages and broken families. It left behind questions. Questions that physicians, rulers, merchants, and ordinary people could no longer ignore. Why had the plague spread so quickly? Could anything have been done to stop it? And perhaps most importantly, how could such a catastrophe be prevented from happening again? For years, Europe had watched medicine fail. The finest physicians had prescribed herbs, bloodletting, perfumes, and ancient remedies. None had stopped the disease. The plague exposed a painful truth. Knowledge inherited from the past was not always enough to face the future. Although medieval doctors still did not understand bacteria or fleas, they slowly began to notice something important. The disease followed people. It appeared wherever infected travelers arrived. Ports became infected after ships docked. Market towns became sick after merchants visited. Villages that remained isolated often escaped the first waves of the epidemic. No one knew exactly why, but observation was beginning to replace assumption. It was one of the first small steps toward a more practical approach to public health. Nowhere was this lesson clearer than in Europe's great seaports. For centuries, ships had carried prosperity across the Mediterranean. They brought silk from Asia, spices from distant kingdoms, grain, timber, wine, and precious metals from every corner of the known world. Trade connected civilizations, but the plague revealed that ships could carry something far more dangerous than cargo. They could carry disease. City leaders realized they could no longer welcome every vessel without caution. If one infected sailor stepped ashore, an entire city might pay the price. Gradually, new rules began to emerge. Instead of allowing arriving crews to enter immediately, some ports required ships to remain anchored offshore for a period of time before anyone could disembark. Officials watched carefully. If sickness appeared aboard the vessel, passengers remained isolated. If no illness emerged after the waiting period, trade could continue. The idea seemed simple: keep possible infection away from healthy communities. Today we call this practice quarantine. Its name comes from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, referring to the 40-day isolation period adopted by several Italian ports during later plague outbreaks. One of the earliest and most influential examples appeared in the maritime Republic of Venice, while the nearby city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, introduced an earlier isolation system of 30 days before extending similar measures over time. The exact number of days mattered less than the principle itself. Isolation could save lives. It was a revolutionary idea. For perhaps the first time, governments were attempting to stop disease before it entered their cities, rather than merely treating people after they had already fallen ill. The ports became places of careful observation. Harbor officials inspected arriving ships. Captains answered questions about where they had traveled. Crew members showing signs of illness remained separated from the population. Cargo was sometimes left untouched for days before being unloaded. Travel, once celebrated without hesitation, was now approached with caution. These measures were imperfect. Many infected people showed no obvious symptoms when they first arrived. Rats hiding below deck ignored every human regulation. Fleas traveled wherever they pleased. Outbreaks still occurred. Yet quarantine slowed the spread often enough to prove its value. Cities that enforced stricter controls sometimes bought themselves precious weeks or even months to prepare. Time had become one of the most valuable medicines available. The plague also encouraged governments to think differently about public health. Instead of leaving disease entirely in the hands of individual physicians, city authorities increasingly accepted that protecting the population required organized action. Officials began recording outbreaks more carefully. Local councils discussed sanitation with greater urgency. Some communities introduced regulations for the disposal of waste, the cleaning of streets, and the management of burial grounds. These were modest beginnings, but they represented a profound change in thinking. Disease was no longer seen only as a private tragedy affecting individual families. It had become a challenge for entire societies. Medicine, too, slowly evolved. Doctors remained limited by the scientific knowledge of their age, but many became more attentive observers. They compared symptoms. They documented patterns. They questioned long-accepted assumptions. Instead of relying solely upon ancient authorities, some physicians began paying closer attention to what they actually witnessed during epidemics. the answers would not come quickly. It would take centuries before scientists discovered bacteria, identified the role of fleas and rats, and developed the principles of modern infectious disease. But the path toward those discoveries had begun. Ironically, one of history's greatest medical disasters became one of history's greatest teachers. The Black Death revealed the devastating cost of ignorance. It showed how dangerous unseen diseases could be. It demonstrated that crowded cities, busy ports, and expanding trade required new ways of protecting public health. Its lessons echoed across generations. Every quarantine station, every harbor inspection, every effort to separate the sick from the healthy, carried the memory of those terrible years. Europe had paid an unimaginable price for these lessons. Millions had died before anyone understood even a fraction of what had happened. Yet from that suffering emerged ideas that would shape the future of medicine for centuries to come. The plague had exposed humanity's weakness, but it had also awakened something equally powerful. The determination to observe more carefully, to prepare more wisely, and to ensure that when the next great epidemic arrived, the world would not face it with empty hands. The Black Death eventually came to an end. The funeral bells grew quiet. The markets reopened. Children laughed once again in village squares. Life returned. But memory did not. Long after the last mass graves had been filled, and the abandoned houses welcomed new families, Europe continued to carry the plague within its imagination. The disease had ended, yet its shadow stretched across generations. People who survived could never forget what they had seen. Parents remembered the children they had buried. Children remembered the parents who never came home. Entire communities remembered the silence that had replaced ordinary life. Some memories were spoken aloud. Others remained too painful for words. Instead, they found another way to survive, through art. Across Europe, painters and sculptors began creating images unlike anything that had come before. Death was no longer shown as a distant event waiting at the end of a long life. It became an active presence, walking among the living, reminding everyone that no earthly power could escape its reach. Kings appeared beside beggars, queens stood beside peasants, bishops walked beside merchants. All were equal before death. One of the most powerful artistic symbols to emerge from this period became known as the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. In murals, woodcuts and illuminated manuscripts, skeletal figures invited people from every level of society into a strange procession. A crowned king, a wealthy merchant, a humble farmer, a child, and an elderly woman all joined the same dance, led by smiling skeletons that cared nothing for titles or fortune. The message was unmistakable. Death comes for everyone. It cannot be bribed. It cannot be outrun. It cannot be persuaded to choose another. To modern eyes, these images may appear unsettling. To people living after the plague, they felt painfully honest. They reflected a world where entire families had vanished within days, where wealth had offered little protection, and where tomorrow had never been guaranteed. The Black Death also left its mark upon literature. Writers no longer spoke only of heroic battles or glorious victories. They wrote about fragile lives, uncertain futures, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Stories became more reflective, asking difficult questions about suffering, faith, and the meaning of human existence. One of the most famous literary works inspired by the plague was the Decameron, written by the Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio. It tells the story of a group of young people who flee plague-stricken Florence and pass the time by telling one another stories. Some are humorous, others romantic, and many reveal both the kindness and the flaws of human nature. It was more than entertainment. It was an attempt to understand a world that had been transformed forever. Across Europe, songs, poems, and folktales carried memories of the epidemic from one generation to the next. Grandparents told grandchildren about the years when church bells never seemed to stop ringing. Travelers spoke of villages swallowed by silence. Families repeated stories of remarkable courage, heartbreaking sacrifice, and unexpected survival. With every retelling, history became memory, and memory became legend. Some details changed over time, the emotions never did. Even centuries later, the Black Death remained a symbol of humanity's deepest fears. Whenever new epidemics appeared, people remembered the stories of the 14th century. Artists returned to the image of the skeleton. Writers compared new diseases to the old plague. Historians searched the past for lessons that might help the present. The Black Death became more than a historical event. It became a warning, a reminder that civilization, however advanced it may seem, is never completely beyond the reach of nature. Perhaps that is why the plague continues to fascinate us today. It was not only one of the deadliest pandemics in history. It revealed something timeless about the human condition. It showed how fear can divide communities, yet compassion can still survive. How knowledge can fail, yet curiosity can lead to progress. How death can seem overwhelming, yet life somehow finds the strength to begin again. Every abandoned village eventually welcomed new footsteps. Every silent church heard new voices. Every generation inherited both the tragedy and the resilience of those who came before. The Black Death has never truly disappeared from human memory. It lives in paintings hanging quietly in museums, in old manuscripts preserved within libraries, in stories whispered across centuries, and in the questions it still asks us today. What would we do if our world suddenly changed overnight? How would we treat one another when fear became stronger than certainty, and when history tested our courage? Would we be remembered for our compassion, or for our fear? That is why, even after nearly 7 centuries, the Black Death continues to haunt humanity. Not because it reminds us how people died, but because it reminds us how people chose to live. The Black Death feels like a story from another world. A world of stone castles, crowded medieval streets, wooden ships, and physicians who searched for answers they could not yet understand. Nearly 7 centuries have passed since those terrible years. Science has transformed. Medicine has advanced beyond anything a 14th-century physician could have imagined. And yet, the question still lingers. Could it happen again? History reminds us that humanity has never truly stopped facing epidemics. Centuries after the Black Death came outbreaks of cholera, influenza, and other deadly diseases. More recently, the world experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, a crisis that once again emptied streets, overwhelmed hospitals, and separated families across continents. The diseases were different. The science was different, but some of the emotions felt surprisingly familiar. Fear, uncertainty, isolation, hope. Once again, people wondered when life would return to normal. Once again, doctors worked tirelessly to understand an unfamiliar threat. Once again, ordinary families discovered how quickly the routines of everyday life could disappear. The greatest difference, however, lies in what humanity has learned. When the Black Death struck Europe, people did not know that bacteria caused disease. They did not know that fleas carried the infection from rats to humans. They had no microscopes, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no laboratories capable of identifying invisible pathogens. They fought an unseen enemy almost entirely in darkness. Today, the situation is profoundly different. Scientists can identify new infectious diseases within days. Laboratories around the world share genetic information almost instantly. Doctors understand how infections spread and how protective measures such as hygiene, isolation, and contact tracing can slow transmission. Hospitals provide supportive care unimaginable in the Middle Ages, and antibiotics can successfully treat plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis when it is diagnosed and treated promptly. Knowledge has become humanity's strongest defense. That does not mean the danger has disappeared. New diseases continue to emerge. Global travel allows infections to cross continents in hours rather than months. Cities are larger than ever before. The world remains deeply connected. A local outbreak can quickly become an international concern, but unlike the people of medieval Europe, we are no longer facing the unknown without understanding. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Black Death is not simply about disease. It is about preparation. The plague taught humanity that waiting until disaster arrives is already too late. It showed the importance of observation, of sharing knowledge, of protecting the vulnerable, of investing in science before the next crisis begins. Many of the foundations of modern public health, from quarantine practices to organized responses to epidemics, trace part of their history back to the painful lessons learned during and after the Black Death. Pandemic changed more than medicine. It changed history itself. It reshaped Europe's economy. It weakened old systems of power. It transformed labor, trade, and society. It influenced art, literature, religion, and the way people understood life and death. Few events have altered the course of civilization so completely. That is why historians continue to study it. Not only because millions died, but because millions who survived built a different world afterward. The Black Death stands as one of history's greatest turning points. A catastrophe that exposed humanity's vulnerability, yet also revealed humanity's remarkable resilience. Today, we possess knowledge that medieval Europe could scarcely imagine, but we still share something with those who lived through the plague. We depend upon one another. In times of crisis, compassion matters as much as courage. Truth matters more than rumor. Preparation matters more than panic. And every generation inherits the responsibility to learn from the one before it. Perhaps that is the Black Death's greatest legacy. It is not merely a story about one terrible pandemic. It is a reminder that history is more than a record of the past. It is a guide for the future. For as long as humanity remembers the years when the world seemed to stop breathing, the lessons born from that darkness may continue to help protect the generations still to come. As our journey comes to an end, let us return one final time to the streets of Europe. Today, they are filled with life. Children laugh in the town squares. Church bells ring not for endless funerals, but to celebrate weddings, festivals, and new beginnings. Travelers wander through ancient stone streets, admiring cathedrals, castles, and quiet villages that have stood for centuries. It is difficult to imagine that these same places once witnessed one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Black Death was far more than a deadly disease. It claimed the lives of tens of millions of people. It emptied cities, erased entire villages, and left countless families forever broken. Yet its legacy reached far beyond the tragedy itself. It transformed Europe's economy. It weakened the old feudal order. It changed the value of labor. It inspired new approaches to medicine and public health. It reshaped art, literature, religion, and the way people understood life, death, and the fragile nature of civilization. In many ways, the modern world grew from the shadows of those terrible years. Even today, every ancient cemetery, every weathered church, and every medieval street quietly preserves the memory of the generations who endured the plague. Their names may have faded from history, but their courage has not. Before we say goodbye, leave us your thoughts in the comments. If you had lived during the Black Death, what would you have done to survive? Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most extraordinary and heartbreaking events. If you enjoyed this story and would like to explore more forgotten civilizations, lost cities, ancient mysteries, and the remarkable moments that shaped our world, please consider subscribing to Chill on Feel Chronicles and turning on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Until our next journey, take care of yourself, stay curious, and remember, every stone, every ruin, and every quiet corner of history still has a story waiting to be told. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next chapter of Chill on Feel Chronicles.